All right, so it's good to be with you again today, and grateful for the opportunity to talk with you a little bit about emotions today. And I want to share with you the role that emotions play in our relationships and how sometimes we can get so caught up in our own emotions to not realize that there's layers of emotions to what's going on at any given point for ourselves, as well as for those that we're trying to have a relationship with. My hope is that as we learn a little bit more about emotions, and you understand a little bit the difference between primary and secondary emotions in relationships and in your own experience, that we can all get a little bit more accurate at understanding what's really going on for me in my communication with others and what's really going on for my partner, right, in a marital situation, that I can understand and see past a little bit emotions that might end up being on the surface. So we hear this concept quite a bit, right? Primary emotions versus secondary emotions. And what's the difference between a primary emotion and a secondary emotion? And the short definition is that a primary emotion is the emotion that's kind of driving or feeding other emotional experiences. It's kind of the emotions that are at the heart of what my experience is, at the very core or center of what's going on in the experience. And secondary emotions are emotions that are kind of derived out of that primary place. There are other emotions that I can feel that are relatable to that primary emotion. And there are other emotions that maybe are easier to show to others. In relationships, we run into this all the time, that there's emotions that are easier for me to be vulnerable with. And so I'll show that emotion in my relationships much more than I might show the emotion that's kind of at the heart of what's going on for me. So we kind of refer to those as secondary emotions. They're emotions that can be derived out of more primary emotions to what's at the heart for me. And there doesn't have to be just one. Oftentimes people feel an array of emotions in response to certain life experiences. And we could be surprised sometimes if you sit down maybe with a sheet of emojis, or you sit down with a deck of emotion cards, and you ask yourself the question, right? Like that really difficult thing I went through in the conflict with my spouse last week, right? We had this conflict, my spouse and I, and what are all the emotions that I felt during that conflict? We can sometimes be surprised at how many emotions you might identify. It's not uncommon as I sit down with couples and we really dive into the emotional experience and understanding a little bit better the emotions they're going through. It's not uncommon that individuals are identifying 10, 14, 20 different emotions that they're experiencing in any particular conflict. So helping kind of organize those emotions and understand those emotions better, and really taking a look at where some of the core emotional experiences might be, and the difference between those core emotions and the ones that are easier for me to show others. All of that process can be super helpful in better understanding yourself and what you're going through, as well as kind of breaking down and understanding a little bit better what's going on with your spouse. So today I want to talk about that a little bit more. I want to talk about how a better understanding of emotions can help you understand yourself better, as well as understand a little bit better what might be going on with your partner or with your spouse, or even with a child. And that's what we'll start today. In our examples, I'm going to start with kind of breaking down the emotional experience of a youth. So I think the easiest way to do this, I've never done this before, and so you're gonna go on this trial ride with me. I've never tried to video as I've been going through this process with somebody before. Usually I'll sit down with a couple, or I'll sit down with an individual in a therapeutic office, and we'll sit down and we'll talk through a little bit the emotions, exploring emotions that are going on in any given conflict going on in their world, or any given difficulty. And I'm going to do that with you today. And I tried to figure out the best way to film it. And I think what I'll do is I'll go ahead and hold the camera. We'll see how this works. But I'll go ahead and hold the camera, and I'll walk you through a little bit how this emotional experience can kind of go down as we're exploring what's going on with any given couple. So let me slide a chair over here for a minute, and I'll walk you through maybe the way that I might if I were working with a couple, or if I were working with an individual who was coming in for therapeutic services. So let's start the first example with a young man. Let's say that the young man is displaying a lot of difficult behaviors. Let's say that one of the primary emotions that people in his world are picking up on is this kind of hateful, angry emotion. So let's say at school and at home that his family's talking about kind of this angry and hateful emotional experience that they run into a lot. And that might be exhibiting in behaviors that are along the lines of a lot of frustration and maybe a lot of resistance in his day-to-day interactions, that those emotions are coming out in his behaviors even. He's being angry, he's being hateful, he's being frustrated, he's being irritated with other individuals. And these are kind of the primary emotions that are being seen at school and at home. By the way, these cards, they're called these mixed emotions cards. You can find these on Amazon. I'll drop a link. They don't sponsor me at all. I just really enjoy their product. They do a really nice job of showing a primary emotion and then having a kind of a picture that goes with the emotion to help you kind of better discern what you might be feeling and kind of relate to a variety of emotions, where some of us kind of just get caught up in one or two primary ones. I either feel happy or I feel angry, right? And there's much more that we feel on a day-to-day basis than just happy or angry. So I really like these cards, and I'm going to use them to kind of explore emotions with you today. But back to our young man, right? So as we kind of take a look at what are the emotions that are happening most commonly at school and at home, these are the ones. This hateful, kind of frustrated, resistant, kind of defensive emotional experience. And if we just stop there, we would not have a complete understanding of what's going on with this young man. So as we explore emotions a little bit deeper, we could start to learn and understand that underneath, right, so more vulnerable than the hateful, frustrated, or resistant emotions, more vulnerable than those is an emotion of feeling panicky and maybe even confused, right? That this young man might be experiencing confusion and panic, maybe even desperation about his grades, about his performance on the football team, that he's not feeling like he's really measuring up in a way that he wants to. And these emotions obviously start to be much more vulnerable than these emotions, right? To show frustration and resistance and maybe some hate or anger on the surface is much less vulnerable, right, than to talk about some of these emotions that might be going on underneath. The panicky, confused, desperate emotions associated with not feeling like he's performing on par with his football team or at school. We might even find out too that there's a layer of feeling ashamed as well in his day-to-day interactions, right? That maybe he's made some mistakes in lying or cheating, or maybe he gave into some peer pressure at school, and it's causing him to feel some ashamed on top of some of the other struggles that he's having in school. We're starting to get a little bit deeper look at the emotional experience of this young man. And if we broke that down even further, we might find out that this young man in general lacks confidence and self-esteem, and maybe even is shy at the heart of him and has a hard time allowing other people to know that he struggles to socially connect, right? And so kind of at the heart of what's going on for him is this shy, kind of ashamed, desperate, kind of confused, panicky experience. And because those are emotions that are a lot more difficult to be vulnerable with, to show those to other people is harder for us on a vulnerability scale. The emotions that other people end up experiencing are these. So you can kind of imagine, right, if you're the parents or you're the teachers and you're interacting with this boy, and most of the time his emotions are in this place, it kind of provokes a response that maybe wants to intervene in bad behavior associated with being hateful and frustrated and defensive. But you never really understand the emotions that are underneath those secondary emotions. We would call these ones secondary emotions. And these ones would be his primary emotions. In other words, these are the real heart of the emotional experience that are driving less vulnerable emotions in this way. Another way to think about that is for this boy to become less frustrated, less desperate, and less hateful in the day-to-day, we would want to really intervene with these emotions. How can we help him feel more confident, less confused, less desperate, right? Less ashamed, and a little bit more confidence in his social connections, right? If we could intervene on those levels, these emotions are likely to naturally dissipate because these emotions are rooted in those. But if the young man never really takes time to figure that out for himself or to work with somebody who can pull out those other kind of primary emotions, right? If he never does that work, all those in his world are only going to experience these emotions, right? And he may even build an identity around those emotions. He might become known as the troubled kid, right? And people will be so busy trying to manage and control those emotions that they may never take a peek into what's driving these primary emotions. And what's driving those primary emotions is our primary point of intervention, right? So therapeutically, our goal is to uncover those primary emotions because that typically is where our solution is to whatever the problems are, understanding what's feeding these emotional experiences and how can we intervene in his world to improve that. So I hope that's making sense. Let me break this down some more. Let's go in next into a couple's experience. All right, now what I have out here is I'm gonna outline a gentleman, right? So let's say this is a husband to a wife, and we'll talk about the wife in a minute. Let's say the most prevalent emotions that he's exhibiting in the relationship is twofold. Let's say that they're anger and depression, right? So he exhibits depressed emotions and angry emotions often, kind of vacillates between the two, right? Sometimes his wife experiences him being angry and irritable and frustrated, and other times he's kind of in a why try, whatever, doesn't matter, I don't matter to you type place, right? So she sees these emotions a lot, him kind of vacillating between a depressed and an angry emotional state, right? And if he never does any work to look underneath that, and she doesn't either, these types of emotions, prolonged, can definitely start to run into a space where they're causing significant strain in a marriage. But as we dig a little bit deeper into emotions, we start to find that there's another layer of emotions that go on for this man. And they're kind of in these categories, right? So there's this discouraged, vulnerable, unsure, and afraid, right? That underneath these external emotions that he's showing more, the angry and depressed, he's feeling some inadequacies around his performance at work and around his wife's willingness to be connected to him. And they manifest in less vulnerable spaces. Because it's a lot less vulnerable to show kind of anger and depressed than it is to display these emotions, right? It's a lot less vulnerable for him to look at it himself, and it's a lot less vulnerable for him to show other people, right? If he just stays in this kind of angry, depressed place, that's the least vulnerable emotion to be in, right? But there's another layer for this man. If we go even deeper and start to understand what's really going on for him closer to the core, we've got a little bit more these emotions, right? So at the heart of the issue for this man, real life story, this isn't just a made up man, this is a real couple, right? At the heart of the issue is regret. Wishing that he had been better in the relationship, that he'd made some mistakes, and wishing that he had been better. this feeling of inadequacy that I talked about earlier with his work and at home, but also loneliness and the disconnect with his wife, feeling guilt, again, connected to the regret, and sadness that the relationship isn't a lot better. It's hard for him to come to his wife and say, I'm feeling these things in our relationship, even though they are the most prominent emotions that he's experiencing. It's lots easier for him to show a little bit more of these emotions, but definitely those emotions, to spend most of the time in a depressed and angry state, right? And maybe once in a while she'll see a glimpse of some of these emotions going on for him. But these ones are at the core. And the reason it's important to know the ones that are at the core is because if this man is ever going to do anything about his anger and depression, if he's ever going to get to a place that he's resolving those issues, he's going to need to take a look at what's driving the primary emotions, not the secondary emotions, right? He's going to need to focus on these emotions and understand a little bit more where are those emotions being driven from, and how can we create some resolution around those emotions. As these emotions get taken care of, these more primary emotions, these secondary emotions that he's experiencing will naturally dissipate, because they only exist as less vulnerable ways to manifest the most vulnerable feelings that he's having. So in other words, you can almost say that his depression in this case and the anger that he displays in this case are not really even real. I mean, they're real in that he feels them, right? But they're only real because they're being manufactured by much more prominent emotional experiences. And these emotional experiences, if we understand them better and we understand what's driving them, we can help create healing at the core that then starts to eliminate these emotions and these emotions, which would become kind of our therapeutic goal. Now let's take a look at his wife. I mentioned that this is a couple, right? So his wife's most prominent emotions, the emotions that she's showing on the surface the most, are these, right? So she's showing irritability and resentment and some jealousy in the relationship. Those are the most prominent emotions that she's displaying, right? So on a regular basis, if you take a look at what's the affect or the emotional experience of the wife, it's in these places. She comes off as irritated, resentful, and jealous emotionally most of the time. And if we just had a marriage that vacillated between her in these places and him in these places, you can start to see how destructive of a relationship that can be. The emotional atmosphere in that relationship, you could cut that tension with a knife, right? So we want to understand a little bit what's going on underneath these types of emotions for her, right? These ones being the most prominent ones that she's displaying on the surface. And as we understand a little bit deeper with her, we're realizing she talks a lot about these feelings of being unfulfilled and hopeless and feeling trapped, right? Unfulfilled in the relationship, hopeless that the relationship is ever going to get better, and trapped, like she's not sure how to make life work outside of the relationship. So almost kind of this overwhelm that's also going on, we want to keep in mind, this overwhelm and worry and stress at the difficulties of day-to-day living. So she has kind of two layers here going on, the trapped, unfulfilled, and hopelessness in the marriage itself, and then she has the overwhelm and worry and stress associated with day-to-day life. Those emotions are connected with children and her full-time work and other areas of her world that just create a level of stress in general, right? And mixed with that is the unfulfilled that she experiences in her marriage. At the heart of emotions for her, the most primary emotions that are going on for her are these two. She has longing for more fulfillment in her marriage with her husband, and she has grief at the lack of that connection and the lack of that fulfillment. That desire for connection and fulfillment would help resolve some of the worry and the stress. It would give her more fulfillment and allow her to feel less trapped and less hopeless, and ultimately help take care of the irritation, resentment, and jealousy that she sometimes experiences most on the surface, right? If she could find some healing to the grief and the longing associated with wanting a more fulfilled relationship. So you can take a look at with both of these individuals, if they never really focus on healing these primary emotions, for her, this grief and this longing experience, and for him, some of the same, the lonely and the guilty and the inadequacy feelings. If they never really get to the heart of their emotional experience, they won't heal the parts of them that need healing to help take care of these most external emotions, right? He will continue to be angry and depressed a majority of the time in the relationship, and she will continue to be irritated, resentful, and maybe even jealous most of the time in the relationship. And when you take those two individuals, her in this emotional state and him in this emotional state, and you mix that together on a day-to-day basis, like we mentioned earlier, that relationship's kind of set up for a disaster. But if we could get her talking about some of these primary emotions going on in her life and some of the other emotions that are connected to it, and really starting to problem solve what are the contributors to that stress and worry and overwhelm, and what are some of the unfulfilled, hopeless, kind of trapped experiences that she's having day to day. If we could get her talking a little bit about those emotional experiences and have him dive in a little bit more to these emotional experiences, the sad, the guilty, the lonely, the regretful, now we could really get somewhere. Now we could be focusing on the heart of the issue going on with this couple in a way that we could maybe start to resolve problems in their relationship. So that would be the goal. As we understand a little bit deeper what somebody is feeling, we also understand a little bit deeper what their needs may be, which is really key to healing, right? The better that we understand an emotion, the feelings, the better we understand the needs. And if we understand the needs better, now we start to have some opportunities for exploration and healing and intervention according to those needs. Like, for example, if we find out that an individual is feeling lonely, right? If that's underneath anger and hurt or hate, is loneliness, right? Loneliness, the antidote to loneliness is connection, right? So as we understand that deeper emotion, that primary emotion connected to the secondary emotions of anger or hate, that primary emotion of feeling lonely, we start to understand the antidote, right? Something that can help heal that emotion. Like connection, right? So that's a really key principle, and the reason that we want to go a little bit deeper into the emotional experiences that a person's having, because feelings often inform needs. The goal would be to get into those more primary emotions and get this couple talking about those emotions in a way that we can resolve those concerns. So I hope that's helpful, right? As you take a look at, in any given situation, one way that you can apply this exercise is taking a look at next time you feel a really strong emotion, right? Trying to pause and ask yourself the question, what is that emotion? And you might find that there's multiple emotions you start to uncover. I just gave you a whole gamut of emotions, right? We talked about probably 20 to 25 different emotions just barely, and there's more emotions than those, right? It's surprising sometimes when you really start to take a look at what am I feeling? You start to realize there's lots more emotions at play than you may realize. And the reason that we want to do that is to understand a little bit what are the emotions that are the easiest for me to feel. And what we mean by that likely is that they're the least vulnerable. So the emotions that come to you the easiest to feel and to show other people, those are typically things like anger, resentment, frustration, irritation. Those emotions are typically secondary emotions, right? They're emotions that are easier to feel and easier to display to others because they don't say such vulnerable things about me, right? They're not very vulnerable emotions. But underneath those, something like anger, for example, underneath anger oftentimes is either fear or sad or maybe even some shame or guilt. those emotions are much more vulnerable to talk about, right? To say that I'm sad when somebody has hurt my feelings is a lot more vulnerable than to say that I'm mad when you've hurt my feelings, right? And so oftentimes we just display the mad. And if I'm not careful, I'll only allow myself to feel the mad. I won't realize that there is sad underneath the mad, right? And because of that, then the only solution to my mad, right, is to get even with the person who made me mad, right? Without ever really looking at the sad, understanding the sad, and maybe even communicating the sad in a relationship that I'm invested in. Particularly in a marriage, it's really important that we start to get into those more primary, more vulnerable emotions so that we can really have some resolution to some of those secondary emotions like anger or depression or irritability or frustration that we share with each other the most. They're the most destructive and they're the easiest to share with one another. The hardest ones to share are the much more tender emotions. And we want to get practiced at that. We want to get practiced at understanding what are those more tender, more sensitive, more vulnerable emotions that are in my day-to-day, that I might know them, that I might be able to have some resolve and intervention in my life around them in a way that I can prevent some of those secondary emotions, the more destructive ones, but the easier ones to feel, like defensive and anger and frustrated, right? That I can prevent those a little bit more in our relationship. That we can have good, solid conversations and resolutions around the primary emotions and start to eliminate some of those more destructive secondary emotions, right? So that's the goal. That's the goal. Now, there's a couple of courses that we've developed that kind of go into this principle a lot deeper. One of them is called the Remember video course. It's in the Renew System for Couples video course. And you ought to check that one out, the Remember course. And it talks quite a bit about this experience. It talks a lot about kind of breaking down the emotional level between my perceptions and my behaviors with others. Another good one is the Advanced Communication Strategies courses. Those advanced communication strategies kind of take a look at the role of emotions in the way that conflict is happening in a relationship and trying to help individuals have a better understanding of that emotional experience in their day-to-day communication exchanges. So take a look at those courses too if you're interested in this topic and want to learn more about it. But I just wanted to break down for you today the difference between what we're talking about when we say a primary emotion. A primary emotion are the types of emotions that are at the heart of the problems or the experiences that I'm having. And then the secondary emotions, those are typically variations of the primary emotion, but they're less vulnerable variations. And if we just focus on those less vulnerable ones, it makes it a lot harder to get to a place of health, healing, and resolution, especially in a relationship. We want to dig a little deeper, explore a little more, and understand those more primary, more vulnerable emotions, because oftentimes that's where the secrets lie for the healing that's needed in my own life and in my connection with others. In addition to checking out the video courses, we also love comments, right? So comment below and talk to us about some of the emotions you might be experiencing, right? And we would love to talk a little bit about those, the emotions that you're having, and maybe taking a look at some of the more primary emotions that might exist. I'd love for anybody out there to kind of share a little bit your experience as you try on that exercise, right? That you identify, I'm feeling something strong, what is it? And then start to understand a little bit the levels and variations of emotion that are connected with that primary emotion that you feel on the surface, right? That we can get into kind of the heart of the emotions versus just the easiest emotions to feel. So feel free to comment in the comments below. Also, like, share, turn on the alarms. We would love to share each of our videos with you as they come out. And we sure appreciate those who subscribe to the channel and interact with us on a regular basis as we explore all the ways in which we can improve our lives and improve our relationships. So I hope you enjoy that. I hope, as always, that you take care of yourself and you take care of your relationship. And we look forward to being with you again soon and providing you more useful and helpful strategies for improving your life and relationships. Take care.